for 2 months. And on that basis, MHRA were saying safe and effective. So they knew all that. And they knew also that they thought the risk balance was too close to call for use in healthy children. But the chief medical officers then looked at it and did a modelling on school days lost and said, oh, well, if we roll out the vaccine, we will reduce school days lost. Now, they admitted that the modelling took no account of past immunity, which David's already referred to, and it also took no account of any potential vaccine side effects. And the calculation was that it would save 15 minutes of lost schooling on average per child, where you'd wait 15 minutes after your Pfizer vaccine in the fall. And you'd probably be out of class for about an hour or something like that. And it was meant to improve mental health, which was hard to account, and particularly if you landed up with a child in your school being helicoptered off the sports field the next week. I don't think that would do a lot for your mental health. But anyway, that was their conclusion. They thought that it was really in the balance and it probably shouldn't go ahead, and it's very obvious from the minutes of those meetings that they had major concerns, the members of the committee, and yet they passed it to the CMOs who said, well, let's go ahead, but let's just give one dose, because we know that the main risks, as Max himself discovered, were after the second dose. But in fact, of course, it then got changed about 2 months later with no further information to say, let's do 2 doses. So then where are we now? Well, now we're in the situation that it's even further in the wrong direction. We now know that Omicron, as we've said, is even milder, and that 85% of children have had it, and natural immunity is stronger than vaccination, all the things that we would have anticipated. We've got Norway and Sweden saying 5 to 11s don't need it. We've got Norway and Holland saying that children who've already had COVID don't need it. The first countries to actually acknowledge that natural immunity is robust. And on the other side, the growing evidence of risks. We know that this vaccine won't be as effective as against Omicron anyway. So at the end of it, and about the various different aspects of myocarditis that we've talked about, 8 to 10% of US primary school children have missed at least 1 day's schooling following vaccination. So if we're using it to try and increase schooling attendance, it's not going to be very good at that. And everything we've really discussed in particular, apart from the non-COVID deaths that Claire discussed, I think is this question about whether vaccination will alter your immune response. And I, as a paediatrician, who obviously throughout my career was encouraging parents to get their children fully vaccinated for everything, this is completely different. The mRNA technology, as Liz mentioned, is very new. And if it alters immunity in any way, that's particularly important. The younger the child, they're at the beginning of their immune career, working out, their immune system is working out what's what and how to do it. And if they get imprinted onto some vaccine that is out of date already, how on earth is that going to help their long-term health? And yet, despite all that, the JCVI conclusion was, oh, let's carry on with the second dose for 12 to 15s. And at the time when we are writing saying, please pause the 12 to 15s because we think there's a significant safety signal that needs investigating, they're saying, oh no, why don't we give it to healthy 5 to 11s as well? So the next slide I'm going to show you is quite distressing. I was told I had to put a warning up, but this is a slide from an education pack that was sent into secondary schools in London. That slide was followed by a slide saying, when can I have my COVID vaccine? Now, if we are suggesting to children that COVID-19 for them is anything like devastating illnesses of smallpox and polio, then no wonder we're not getting informed consent. This, to my mind, is absolutely unethical. In fact, somebody told me I had to put a warning up before I showed you this slide. They were upset I put it in the slide stack last night when I was sharing it. And yet that's in secondary schools in London. And this is wrong. So I don't want to say any more. I think it's time to open this up for discussion. Any questions at all?
Before we start, could you bring us up to speed with the JCVI's reaction to the CCVAG's letters, please?
Yes, I'm not sure I mentioned that apart from our letter, which we sent 2 weeks ago, by complete coincidence, the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Pandemic Recovery had written a very similar letter, also asking for a pause. And that was signed by a dozen MPs and 3 members of the House of Lords, and also some of the senior clinicians, I think I'm not sure, no, Roland Salmon certainly signed both letters, a number of people have. And they had a reply to their first letter, just as we've had replies to very early letters, but then the reply is always very bland and it doesn't actually answer the questions you've asked. So they then sent another letter a couple of weeks ago and they've had no reply. We've had no reply this time round from the JCVI at all. The only replies in the past from the JCVI have usually been to say it's the responsibility of the MHRA. And the MHRA, when they approved for temporary authorization the 12 to 15s, they only looked at Pfizer trial data. They did not look at real world data. They said they hadn't. So they are looking at the data from a drug company that is going to be making all profits on this. So that is worrying. We went today to deliver the letter to the JCVI, having had no reply, and now we've got our 700 signatures instead of the 90 we started with. So it was a nice fat packet, and we went along with, I have to say, a camera crew, which perhaps was a mistake as it turned out, because there's Liz and me and a couple of others who'd signed the letter about to hand it in. I phoned yesterday, and they knew we were going to bring this letter to deliver it in person to the office in Waterloo Road. And we just took some photos outside, and then I stepped forward to the door, and suddenly the lights had gone off, and the door was locked. So I was a bit puzzled, and there were 3 guys inside there. I could see them. I was sort of having waving and thought they'd come across to open the door. We couldn't find a buzzer. And so in the end, I phoned the same number I phoned yesterday, and they said they would couldn't understand why we couldn't get in. But she said, I'll hang on, I'm not in the same building, so she would inquire. Then eventually somebody else said, oh no, it should be fine. And then I had to phone again, and then we phoned again, and then they said, oh no, there's a bit of a problem at the moment because there's a security alert because of a protest. And I said, well, if we're the protest, we're just 4 women with a letter. I think we could have done better than that if it was a real protest. We could have got several thousand, if not 1 million. But anyway, that was our protest. So in the end, they said they were sending the deputy manager down, and at that point I'd left in a taxi to come here because I thought, I didn't want to be late for the press conference. But Anna, fortunately, was still there, and this guy suddenly emerged and she handed him the letter. So they have got the letter. So, but it is quite worrying to think that the level of anxiety is such that you can't even hand a letter into a public building.
Are there any questions?
Hello, thank you so much. I just am so impressed by the conference, by all your presentations. I can't tell you how important I think it is, and I hope I'll aim to get transcripts of everything I've got and anything else I've missed and publish each and every one. It needs documenting at every possible level, spoken, streaming, and then endless PR typing. Very, very impressive and very full. I've got 2 questions. I'll try and be quick. One man never seems to get any attention or focus in our attempts to expose what's really going on or why they're doing what they are. And that is, I think he's the current chairman of the JCVI, a Dr. Wen somebody. Does anybody know him? Do any of us? He never seems to get written to. He always seems to keep his head under the parapet. He's been involved in so many things, and I think for me, it would be nice if we began to put some of these people's faces in the frame. These are the people making these decisions. So that was one question. The second was, with the Pfizer trials on the children that you've reviewed, was there any trial for what the effect of the second vaccine on children would be? Has the second number 2 vaccine ever been trialled? Not that I think any child should be in that trial, but
I could probably ask those. Thank you very much. Kathy Gindle from the Conservative Woman. The first answer to your first question is he was the main name on the envelope we handed in today. So he's Professor Wei Shen Lim, and he's based in Leicester, but he was the first name on the letter. And he did reply earlier, about 6 months ago to the first letter I sent, but I haven't had any replies more recently. I don't know him personally. But the second question is, that study was including both doses. It was based on the 2 doses. Certainly the boosters for children, I think the ongoing data for that is very limited. And in terms of the 5 to 11s trial, I think it's important to note that Pfizer, in their own submission to the FDA for temporary authorization, stated that the trial was too small to pick up rare effects such as myocarditis, and they will be rolling out post-marketing a cohort study which would report back in 5 years, in 2027. So what they're really saying is, give it to millions of children around the world, and in 5 years' time, we might find there's a serious side effect. And that is, as Matt's saying, you know, this is not about informed consent. Anybody else?
Okay. Thank you very much.
Introduce yourself, and you.
Yes, my name's Alan Black, and I'm a retired pharmaceutical physician, and I'd like to thank the panel for a fascinating session. Thank you very much indeed, and particularly thanks to Max for coming to speak to us. I have a short question with a little bit of background, so if you bear with me for a while. None of the COVID-19 vaccines, including the Pfizer one, currently has a full marketing authorization, a full license in common parlance. What they have is a thing called a conditional marketing authorization, a conditional license, if you like. In their guidance regarding CMAs, which is short for conditional marketing authorization, the MHRA say, in their own words, that they may grant a CMA where comprehensive clinical data is not yet complete, but it is judged that such data will become available soon. Now, I understand that the first data submitted by Pfizer to the MHRA for review and assessment was submitted in October 2020. I believe that's true. Pfizer's CMA was issued in January 21, and it was renewed by the MHRA in December 21, so we still have a conditional marketing authorization. So, our regulatory authorities have still not yet judged that the data sets, the safety and efficacy are sufficiently complete or comprehensive for them to be confident enough to issue the Pfizer vaccine, or any of the COVID vaccines for that matter, with a full marketing authorization, a full license. Some of the safety and efficacy data required by the MHRA as a condition of the Pfizer CMA, data that's required to fill the gaps in the safety and efficacy databases that have been identified by the MHRA. Some of these data are not due to be submitted to the MHRA until 2024. How do the panel think this conditional or provisional regulatory status of the vaccines should influence any decision to extend the use of COVID-19 vaccination to healthy children?
Well, I've been following what's been going on in the States, where what's been given to the regulators appears to be, or what's been disclosed to the public in the trial data seems to be a very, very small amount of the data that was actually available. So there are apparently hundreds of thousands of pages of the clinical trial data that the FDA, the Federal Drug Agency in America, who are like our MHRA, they have, and they have applied to the courts a few weeks ago, saying they didn't want to release it for 75 years. I mean, it was a bit of a story, but it ended up that they wanted the date for release of all of that data to be in 75 years' time. There's currently legal challenges going on. I believe it might now have been reduced to 8 months. But what's fascinating is the idea that there could be no public scrutiny of this, data which only took a few months to actually accumulate. It's probably 6 months worth of trial data, and they wanted to just release 500 pages a month, I think it was, for the next 75 years. So it raises the question: what is in that data that they're so worried about? Why can't we just see it all? It wouldn't take long for a team of doctors, if they were given that data, give them 3 or 4 months, they could go through it. And how can we possibly give obtain informed consent and get informed consent from people to have this vaccine if they don't have that data at their fingertips, and we can't see what the issues are, if there are any. I mean, we have no idea. So, and I suspect it's a similar situation here with the MHRA, but I don't know whether that's been quite so publicly available.
Like sit on this. Thank you. I would just like to add to that. I know people who've seen that data and they've gone through it and they've analysed. What that data shows, if you have an SAE, a serious adverse event recorded to the Pfizer vaccine, you have a 3% chance of death, which compares with an 0.085% chance of death from all populations with the vaccine. That is what they're trying to hide. And it is worth reminding, not just hiding away from things that, you know, an awful lot of stuff that I've been wanting to talk about. You can't talk about this, that and the other. But it is out there, it's in the public domain. Pfizer, as an organisation, have had 31 criminal prosecutions executed by the FDA for fraud, misrepresentation, withholding data, bribing commissions and bribing regulators. This is the nature of the beast you're dealing with. So why should we be enthralled to an organisation like this who tells us what the conditions are for which populations we can use with their vaccine, that we do not have access to the raw data? And the people who have access to that raw data said it's bloody obvious why they don't want us to see it. Now, that should be fairly obvious to anybody. If somebody wants to, has got bad data, they try and hide it. I mean, I was involved with the origins of the virus. It was obvious to me that this virus had inserts. It had been engineered and escaped the laboratory. We weren't allowed to mention that. It was, oh, this, that, and the other. But China go out of their way to help us by saying, you're not allowed to see anything. They shut the laboratories, they sterilised everything, and said, oh no, it was a natural jump. It occurred 1,000 miles away from the fact of you. I mean, so when people lock down the evidence, you've got to be quite reasonably suspicious. What are they trying to hide? We now know in the origins they were trying to hide it, and Matt Ridley has come out and said, obviously it must have come from the laboratory and escaped, but we'll never know. I disagree on that because I've got this analysed the sequence data. It's 1 billion to 1 that possibly arranged naturally. And we're dealing with the same now here with the same paradigm that they're trying to hide the data that we need to know to protect those who are not going to benefit from the vaccine. And I think it's a scandal. It's an absolutely enormous scandal when they're wanting to immunise billions of children throughout the world with something which they know has a significant side effect profile. You've heard today, the side effect profile is, and in my personal experience, the younger you are, the worse it is. And we've heard that we've been able to focus on myocarditis in young men. So I think this is extremely important to bear this in mind. And I thank you very much for raising this issue that it's not a licensed product at all. It's a very conditional. Thank you.
I think just to follow on from that, yes, if one mentions that it's still in the research phase, that kind of gets labelled as conspiracy theory. But I think it's very important we do remember that all these drugs are still in the trial phase. And also interestingly, the BMJ had a leader very recently in which they were saying, normally for any publication, if you want to get an article into the BMJ on your research, you have to let them have the raw data. So why does that not apply to these vaccines? So they've been speaking out very loudly, saying exactly what you've just said.
Hello, I'm Sonia Elijah, and I just wanted to thank you all for this very informative panel today. I wanted to let you know that I did write back in December. I analysed one of the safety documents that was released by the FDA, one of Pfizer's own safety reports. It was the cumulative analysis of all these sort of vaccine adverse events. And I thoroughly read through that report and I analysed it, and it's very alarming what was reported. Over 1,200 deaths, this was within a 3-month period. Women were 3 times more likely to be affected by these adverse events. There were recorded spontaneous abortions when the vaccines were given to pregnant women, and just very large proportions of serious adverse events. and this was published for Trial Site News, the US publication. I was interviewed by an Australian company called Cowkind Media, and they have their own YouTube channel. They interviewed me based on my report and my analysis. Over 2 days, the video went viral, over 1 million views, and on the third day, YouTube censored the video, banned it. So this is just my own personal experience, and I wanted to share that with you today.
So the question is, I'm not medical, so I'm talking about still, I work on GB News, and I work on talk radio, and I was cooked before all of this happened, but because of this happening, I thought I had to speak up and start pointing out something very sinister and something very wrong going on. So this question I know you can't answer, but I want to put it out there, is why are the governments of the world allowing Big Pharma to inject our children with a chemical that could well do them harm? I don't expect an answer, but that is the question that needs to be asked across the world.
I mean, certainly, if I, as a paediatrician, or Andrew Pollard comes back 3 years ago and says, I've got a brand new vaccine, I've got no safety data on it, but it's going to be fantastic for children to treat them for the common cold, we would have been reported to the GMC, or the 3 wise men insisted in your hospital. I mean, that would have been totally, out with any normal behaviour for a medic. So I can't answer your question. I think it's the huge question that is on everybody's mind.
I can, and I think I can try anyway. Because I think the fault lies elsewhere. I don't think the fault lies with the pharmaceutical companies. Yes, there are concerns about the data and the access to it. I completely agree with that. I think those data should be brought into the public domain. But I don't think it's the pharmaceutical companies which have been pressing and seeking to market their product. It's been the governments which have been scrambling about to get those products and to deploy them as widely as possible. This is governments who want to use the vaccine rather than companies that desperately wish to sell it. And the issue there, I think, is that it ran away with it. That if you go back to what Kate Bingham was recommending in the end of 2020, beginning of 21, was that just those 5 priority groups, essentially anybody over 50, healthcare workers, plus people with particular risk factors, were going to be vaccinated. Quote, this is not going to be a vaccine for everyone. Then government, chief medical officers, maybe JCVI, I thought that at that time they were less biased, it was more the chief medical officers who wanted to vaccinate as widely as possible. They seemed to convince themselves that all these products had 70 to 95% efficacy in preventing infection. If we can vaccinate everybody, we can squeeze these viruses out of circulation. They were dead wrong, because the virus evolved to become more transmissible, and the immunity behaved exactly like natural immunity to the 4 long-established coronaviruses, meaning it went down. But it went down more quickly after vaccination than after natural infection. So they swapped from this reasonable idea of vaccinating risk groups to an idea of vaccinate everybody, squeeze the virus out of circulation as we did with polio, and the vaccine's not capable of doing that, and they are not capable of admitting what they tried to do and that it has failed. And I think that's what's so critical about Iceland, because they have essentially
Because they don't care about the damages that they'll do to our children just so they won't be seen to make the right point. I agree with you. If you're vulnerable, if you need it, fine, take this vaccine. But the reality is that governments across the world, look at this, children, babies, to be vaccinated for something that can only do them harm. My mind cannot conceive that this is continuing, that we're sitting actually in this room having this conversation. It's gone beyond sinister now, and the mainstream media will not allow us to discuss it. We get called conspiracy theorists and the terrible things that I've been called, just wanting to ask a few questions. And I'm worried about the state of governments around the world continuing to
Absolutely.
push this.
Well,
Yeah.
absolutely, I'm worried by governments around the world on many counts. But what I would say is, my opinion, which may be right or wrong, I think there was more cock-up and mad optimism from early in the history of vaccines than a conspiracy there. And they just become more desperate and they double down. Oh well, if we vaccinate all adults, that's not achieved. It's not got the R number there. Or we vaccinate children as well. And keep squeezing.
I think
We've got a couple of more questions.
I just want to say that I think you are an honourable and kind man, but the reality is that some people are making phenomenal amounts of money from this vaccine, and that's the reason that it's been shut
Just want
down.
to quickly comment on this.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think this is why it's really important that we go back to talking about ethics, because actually what we've allowed as a society is that for governments and politicians to be practicing medicine, that's not safe for anybody, it's dangerous. We've got to go back to the doctor-patient relationship. We are hearing of people all the time who've had a bad reaction to the first vaccine. They are not allowed an exemption for their second vaccine. You know, doctors are saying, yeah, no, I don't think you should have another one, but I'm not going to write you an exemption. What is going on? You know, we cannot have a doctor not able to make us, you know, a professional medical decision on behalf of his patient sitting in front of him or her. And I think that's where we've gone wrong. And as patients, as the public, we have to demand that we go back to that practice of, you know, individualized doctor-patient medicine, and not governments practicing medicine through policy. It doesn't work. It's dangerous. The greater good is a very dangerous ideology, and we cannot allow our society to go down that route.
So Matt was just going to comment on the
I just want to add my own personal thanks. Today is, of course, Freedom Day, and I follow you on Twitter and watch your and follow Adam Brooks, and you work with together, don't you?
Yeah.
So I'd actually just like to say thank you actually for the work that you've been doing, Adam's been doing, and the whole team, because I don't believe that today we'll be actually being having our civil liberties back today. So actually I just want to say thank you. Thank you for coming today.
I too respect you, very sir, but I'm afraid I disagree as well. There is a word that's the elephant in the room, and the word is corruption. There is absolutely, my personal was. There is absolutely no way that the censorship, the controlled censorship of the media and social media, and any one word that mentions anti-vaccine or ivermectin is immediately withdrawn from the world stage. This is not accidental. There may well have been cock-ups on the way, but going right back to your point about Wuhan, you know, the investigation was carried out by Peter Daszak, who himself was working with Wuhan with American money developing the vaccine. Daszak then advised the White House. He then organised a letter to the medical journals, rubbishing any theory that it could have been from the lab, but had to be natural. The man is conflicted, right, left, and centre. And I'm ashamed, and I would apologise to everybody about the way the media have behaved over all of this. I was the boss of Sky News at one time and ITV, and I sat at home angry and frustrated at the way they're behaving. But it can't be accidental. You know, we have tried. I'm now working with a group of journalists, and we're trying really hard to break the mould, and we're writing online and elsewhere. We cannot get these stories into the mainstream media. Now, there are many reasons, but it is being controlled, and it's naive to think it's not. I don't know, you know, there are two, your profession, the medical profession, and my trade. I don't call that a profession, because there don't need any qualifications. But both of us should be ashamed of the general mix. Where are everybody else? Max is one of the people I've spoken to in the past, but I'm now talking to victims every day, and it's horrific. And the doctors know that they're seeing more examples in the hospitals, and they're not speaking up. And the media are not speaking up. So you have to ask why. It isn't all about a cock-up, believe me. It cannot be. It just cannot be. Is there any mainstream media here at all? You know, I mean, I've sent an invitation.
So we've only got time for a couple more questions.
Okay,
Do you have a
I
question?
just say this one thing. I've sent my former colleagues at Sky, people I work with, I've sent them a personal invitation today on the back of lots of things, and they still haven't come. You know, you are eminent scientists and doctors with opinions, and what does your boss say? Misinformation. Follow
We're
the
going to have to go
science.
to another question. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
Mark. Thank
Oh,
you
that's
very
right.
much.
Thank you. I have two questions, and both represent the young people, if you like. The first one, there's been lots of mention from the panel about healthy children. I recently saw a children's charitable organisation that was begging for the vaccine for the vulnerable children with difficulties. And I feel that some clarity on the panel's opinions for those children, for whom it's not too late, would be useful. And I'd just like to share one very brief testimony of somebody I know, a father, divorced from the mother, conflicting views on the vaccine for their autistic son, who was in a care home. She wanted it for him, he didn't. A GP who didn't know the child was brought in with this panel discussion on whether the child should have it or not. Effectively, to cut to the chase, the GP prescribed a drug that would sedate him. It didn't work for him and he pulled away and only had a half of the second jab, and then they still wanted him to have a third and just up the dose of the tranquilizing drug. So I would be interested in the panel's views on the vaccine for vulnerable children, given that there are some parents and organisations representing those children who are clamouring for it, and GPs who clearly think it's their job to give it, regardless of what the child or the vulnerable adult wants. And the second thing is that I represent pregnant women with my organisation, Syntonic Birth. Throughout this, I've been deeply concerned about the advice coming down from the organisations that are there to protect women, advising for them to get it. And I understand that there's just been another announcement from Chris Whitty to say, if you're pregnant, there's lots of data to show you get it. So could the panel please address those two cohorts of people? Oh, sorry, I would just say that my sister-in-law she got it when she was pregnant as an early cohort, second jab in the summer, and was pregnant and suffered neurological difficulties, lost the use of her legs, and was diagnosed with functional neuropathy or something. Basically means I don't know what it is. And again, it's not been linked, so I don't know if she would have had the third by now.
I would pick up on the first question. It's interesting because when back in the summer they said that the JCVI said they weren't recommending it for healthy children, but they would recommend it to vulnerable. I put something on Twitter about all of that's good news, that they're being, cautious. And I had a response from a parent saying, so you saying my disabled child isn't worth worrying about, which was chilling because actually, of course, they need protection from harm just as much, if not more so, than healthy children. We had contact a family get in touch earlier on when I was campaigning, saying they thought that our campaign against children's vaccines was preventing their children getting the vaccines they wanted. And the worry is that if you look at the sort of children who have really come to grief with COVID, they have major comorbidities. And yet, at the end, the list that's gone out is simply if you're on the Learning Disabilities Register. Now, there was a study from March 2020 to March 2021, because not a lot of children die, and there is an existing deaths registry where every child who dies, there's a notes review and so on to look for avoidable factors. And out of 61 children who died with a PCR test positive within the previous month, only 25 of those were deemed to have died with COVID as related to their death, because most of them, they just happened to have a positive test. They might have died in a car crash or whatever. But of those 25, 6 were healthy children and 19 had comorbidities. And they were major. There wasn't a child with Down syndrome who died, except there was a child with Down syndrome who got major congenital heart complications as well. And there wasn't a child with learning difficulties who died. There were children with cerebral palsy and, curvature of the spine, multiple admissions to intensive care for previous infections. So that was the sort of child. And I think if you're the parent of a child in that situation, it's a very reasonable choice. But of course, the choice was already there because a clinician, that comes back to Liz's point about the personal relationship, a clinician could always have prescribed, and there was a system for paediatrician with a parent, one-to-one, discussing the risk to that child of getting COVID. Shall we give this unlicensed drug or not? And that you could do. So it didn't need to be approved in order to allow genuinely vulnerable children, in conjunction with their paediatrician, to have the immunisation. So I think the blanket thing of just saying, oh, let's give it to any child on the register is really not good. I personally am not an obstetrician, and thank goodness I don't have to answer the second question.
Does anyone want to come in or go to our final question or two?
My feeling is we should leave the middle question because, to be honest, it's a completely different, it's not something any of us have been majorly looking at.
Okay, we'll go to this lady and then maybe one final question to this lady.
Hi, my name is Irina. I'm a medical doctor, junior doctor in the NHS. And at the moment, I'm ashamed of my profession. And I just want to ask a few questions. First of all, is why, as a junior doctor, I have never been taught how to report side effects of the vaccine and what to look for. This is in the hospital that I work, no one has been told that. And secondly, is it legal to advertise an experimental prescription medical treatment? And how much money the government has spent in view of the failing NHS to advertise vaccine over the last 2 years? Thank you very much.
I'd like to address the first aspect of that, and that is that doctors are basically being orchestrated, brainwashed into saying, you've got to give this vaccine, there's no side effects. Now, this brainwashing has gone so far, someone right at the top of the task force said, well, there are a few problems, but at least across the board, there are no serious side effects whatsoever, aren't we lucky? And I basically had to say, sorry, I'm a cold-faced doctor, I see patients, this, that, and the other, and this is just not true. And I really got two things I wanted to really stress here. One is, we talk about the birds from Pfizer and how bad it is that they want to keep it hidden, but there is something even more hidden here, and that's what you brought up about the doctors. They are not reporting the side effects that so clearly exist. I know some serious side effects, and the doctors haven't reported it. And the person says, please report this, it is associated. And they say, no, it's not, it's just a coincidence. Well, it's not my job to report it. Go back to the person who gave you the vaccine and get them to report it. Of course, they're not here because the vaccine clinics closed down. And so these side effects are not getting reported. So what you're seeing is the tip of the iceberg. And that's, I agree with you. I'm also disgusted with my profession, the way they have taken everything lying down. It's appalling. The second point I'd like to make, which comes from this battery, this sort of onslaught of giving people unnecessary vaccination. I actually raised this point several times, and nobody sensibly gave me a reply. And once I raised it on GB News in an interview too, is why would you give somebody a vaccine who tells you that they've had the infection and they've recovered very well? But why wouldn't you test to see if they need the vaccine? Oh no, they said it's too much trouble to test, it's much easier to give the vaccine. And on one occasion I pointed out, well, I've just come back from Croatia and I had more bloody tests than I had hot dinners, you know, so it's not difficult to do tests for it. And that is something I fought passionately for. It is very easy to do a T-cell test. Have they got the memory that they do not need? No, they will not do it. It is very simple. If they did that for everybody, they would save an enormous number of vaccines, and the vaccines cost far more than the tests. So what bit do they not, well, what bit do they not want to get? So I think it's really bad giving vaccines to people who've already been exposed to the vaccine, to the virus itself, and have a very good immune response, when for young people, all you're going to do is perturbate a fine T-cells controlling response, knock it off course, make it inflammatory, so it can't see in the other bugs coming in. Because that's one of the things that happened to you that gave you the myocarditis. So thank you very much for bringing that up. I can't answer all the other questions.
With regard very briefly to the government spending, that is absolutely outrageous. Two-page spread in the Daily Telegraph, tail end of last week, I think it was, encouraging people to be vaccinated, not because it was going to protect them individually, but the headline cases and also case histories were, I am getting vaccinated to protect other people. Despite great clarity now that the vaccine, whatever its merits for preventing severe disease in the vulnerable, does not prevent infection and transmission. Absolutely disgraceful advertising, all being paid for out of our taxes.
Okay.
Yeah, just like, because you feel like pregnancy thing, I'm quite hard as well, unfortunately not working in the NHS at the moment, which I'm quite pleased about. But I'd quite like to go back, and all this vaccine mandate nonsense, quite frankly, I was fighting that cause for many of my colleagues. But I was, in the beginning, I was thinking, am I the only one who thinks it's totally insane to be giving these experimental injections to pregnant women? We know how difficult it is to give, you can't get a drug license for pregnancy. You really have to weigh out the risk benefit analysis, and there was like no informed consent. We don't know what this is doing to pregnant women. It does come with children because, this spike protein is replicating, it goes across the placenta, it's in the fetus, this is lifelong problems. I wrote to the MHRA in February 21, and I said, I wrote to the NMC and the RCM, and I was like, seriously, what are you doing? They didn't reply for about 2 months. Eventually, I got a nice little beige, bland reply, which didn't answer any of my questions, so I was smiling. And actually, that letter's being used in the legal case. It's communist documentation against them because they cannot say they did not know that people, yes, I'm a midwife, but also a mother, and concerns about women. They cannot say they didn't know. And I have a friend whose mother was given the thalidomide drug, and so it's just too close to the bone. I just think it's totally insane. Oh, you're nodding, you agree. Thank you.
Does anyone want to comment?
So I feel so lonely, and I've been really speaking out for many midwives who have said
Yeah, and just to add to that, the UK Medical Freedom Alliance, we've written lots of letters on pregnant women and the vaccines. So we've written ones to NMC, to the Royal College of Obstetricians, to the MHRA. So there's lots of reference letters out there which may help you to learn about that. And also, what's interesting is, of course, most women who are pregnant are young and healthy. So although it raises your risk slightly to be pregnant compared to your peer who is not pregnant, you're still very low risk. And I think what's really worrying is a lot of people are walking around terrified that they're high risk from COVID, whereas in fact they've gone from an extremely low risk to a slightly less extremely low risk. And I think that is clearing with informed consent again, and also making people behave in a very, very anxious way during pregnancy, which is when you don't want to be with high levels of cortisol and stress and anxious. So yeah.
We're going to do one more question, Peter.
Okay. My name is Radek. I'm here in first place as a concerned father. I'm thinking about the future of young generation. My question is from two parts. So first one would be, what can we do to prevent such situation that happened? How can we prevent hijack of the science, real science, merit science by politics? Like we had an argument by likes of Dr. Fauci, who was saying attack on me or questioning me is attack on the science, or we had a statement like, let's say, WHO, who changed the definition of the pandemic. And basically, if we would really go down to the nitty-gritty of what pandemic indicators should be, like amount of people who died, amount of ICU treatment, how can we prevent this? And the second thing is, how can we re-educate people? Because we've came to such a division in a society, and the basis of the society is trust. We had this trust, and we were trusting each other. And I've listened to many of people who spoke today during your campus interview. And first of all, debate was disallowed. It was heavily censored. How can we re-educate people so we don't just have propaganda machine, bullying, intimidating people, calling them anti-vaxxers? How can we revert back to actual science? So let's say if you want to state if person actually died on certain disease, why can't we have post-mortem? Why can't we have merit data? Why can't we have analysis? Not vague statements like somebody who was positively tested within 28, 60 days or whatever the period, and then run by the bus and is being counted.
Okay, I think the panel gets the.
So two things: how we prevent and how can we re-educate people to real science.
I think the crux of the problem is that politics and science are opposites. Politics need to have certainty, but whatever happens to be, you need to be saying things confidently. And science is all about uncertainty. Science is all about being wrong. We're learning all the time in science from mistakes, not from thinking that we're right. You can't do science if you think you're right all the time. So they are fundamentally clashed from the beginning. And we're in a society now where debate is dead. People don't want to listen to things that don't conform to their prior beliefs. And that is a very, very difficult hole to get out of in terms of social media bubbles and that kind of thing. And we also have a problem with politicians who, very few of whom have a scientific background. And I think that is a problem that we do need to address longer term, but clearly that's going to take a long time to fix. But you know, we can't have them just without that background making decisions the way that they are making them. And there's my hope is that in time all of the truth is going to come out, and it's going to be revolutionary, because when people see how they've been lied to and see all the deceit, then that's the point at which people are not going to let it happen again. But we have to get to that point. It's only when we can get to that point that we can actually start thinking about building up new systems and having things less centralised.
Can I just make a very quick comment? As a clinician who trained and went in to do really basic science, really focused on basic science for a long time, I never thought I'd live to see the day when COVID ushered in the death of science. Because that is what I have witnessed. My colleagues do not want to discuss it. Science is meant to be looking at the evidence and coming to a conclusion. If it's not obvious, you set up an experiment and look at the result. They just don't want to know. And Matt Ridley told me that basically when he was doing the research for his book, he went to the Royal Society. It's meant to be the pinnacle of our scientific institutions. And everybody from the top down refused to discuss the origin of the virus because they said it was so obvious it would come from a zoonosis, it would come from a bacterium. Well, I had held the institution in a great esteem. After that, I thought, you know, what is the point? What is the point when scientists will no longer be science?
Yeah.
Max?
Picking up on your point, there is no debate in this country anymore about anything. You are up against the mainstream media, you're up against the establishment. And although having studied law for 4 years, there's one thing that clicks into my mind is Article 10 of the Human Rights Act 1998. That's freedom of expression. And we really, really don't have that in this country, and there's a plethora of these issues. And from the sounds of it, in the medical sphere, you don't have that anymore. And as a victim of the vaccine injury, I can wholeheartedly support everything that everyone is doing here. And that if there has to be an initiative going forward to make sure that the truth comes out, that rightness comes out, that justice prevails, that is the only way of going forward, and that's the only way of having this whole mess ever ending. Thank you.
I'm afraid we are going to have to wrap it up. But the world has changed, because we don't just have the JCVI now, we have the CCVAG, the Children's COVID Vaccine Advisory Group. And the government might listen to its yes men, but now parents have other people and other opinions to listen to. So that's why we're hosting this. That's why we're grateful for all the media that did show up. And that's why I'm sure we'll be doing this in the future. Ros, do you want to say a final word?
I don't really need to. I don't have to. I think I'll leave you with Nelson Mandela.
Thank you.
camera. I'm just going to do a.
Kind of lost the plot. What did it actually go out?
Talk to you afterwards.
Okay. Thank you, Dan. I really appreciate it. I'm sorry for all this.
I can't find the. Okay, everyone. So thank you very much for tuning in here live for the press conference in London with the Children's COVID Vaccine Advisory Group. Apologies for the technical issues that we've seen throughout the live stream. The good news is we've recorded the entire event in 4K, which we're going to produce and put out in full, so you can see all the talks in full definition. So thank you so much for tuning in and sharing this broadcast. So many pertinent points, so many great questions asked, some fascinating data points and insights. And I'm left with one sentiment that there is much work to do and that we have to link arms with one another and dig deep to pursue not only the truth about the situation, but also tackle the underlying issues that we've heard about here today. Everything from the corruption, how politics and science don't mix, some of the media influences, the role of censorship and free speech. There is much to be done. And whilst the restrictions in the UK and other parts of the world may start to fade, the points raised today about how we move forward, how do we start to learn from this, how do we make sure this doesn't happen again, how do we unravel the damage, the work is just beginning on that, and there's a long road ahead. So thank you so much for joining this live stream. If you haven't subscribed already, please go to danjgregory.com/pandemic for any future content and campaigns. You can also join our community at weareelevate.org. But I will see you very soon, and thank you so much for